Bienvenue, bienvenue à toutes et à tous à cette conférence donc, qui est organisée conjointement par le Centre Lemaire de recherche en gestion responsable et le thème fédérateur de l'Université de Sherbrooke autour des changements climatiques et de l'environnement. Alors, on a deux titres pour la conférence. Il y a le titre court qui est Open Strategy et il y a le titre un peu plus lent que je vais vous lire parce qu'il est révélateur de ce dont on va parler. Donc, les grands défis du XXIe siècle, donc changement climatique, pauvreté, inégalité, discrimination et bien d'autres. Comment favoriser l'action collective grâce au processus de décision stratégique, inclusif, participatif ou encore ouvert. Et aujourd'hui, on a le grand privilège d'avoir avec nous professeur Pr Eero Vaara, qui est venu spécialement d'Angleterre pour une série de conférences dans celle-ci. Donc, Eero est professeur depuis une vingtaine d'années, d'abord en Finlande, avec une expérience en Suède, en France, et depuis 3 ans, donc il est professeur actuellement d'organisation et d'impact à la Saïd Business School, donc à l'Université d'Oxford, et il travaille principalement sur les questions de stratégie et de changement, donc sous diverses perspectives, et actuellement, il travaille beaucoup sur la perspective dite de la pratique, donc les processus micro du changement. Et donc, il va venir nous partager un peu ses travaux de recherche, sa pratique aussi, ses travaux en tant que consultant, en tout cas en tant que membre de certains conseils d'administration. Et ensemble, on va essayer de comprendre un peu comment le fait de repenser notre façon de prendre des décisions stratégiques peut être utile, voire même important et donc indispensable pour résoudre certaines grandes problématiques. Donc, la conférence va avoir lieu en 2 temps. Une conférence d'à peu près 30, 40, 45 minutes. On peut prendre les questions en cours de route. Donc, si vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas. Et puis, dans un deuxième temps, on va ouvrir un peu la discussion. Donc, ce sera plus une sorte de débat. On peut aussi ne pas être en accord avec les propos de Eero Vaara, puis auquel cas, on peut aussi manifester donc, son désaccord. Alors, la conférence va avoir lieu en anglais, mais ce que vous devez savoir, c'est que professeur Vaara est trilingue, à tout le moins, donc il comprend très bien le français, il parle aussi très bien le français, mais il aimerait faire sa conférence donc, en anglais, mais vos questions pourraient être posées en français, là, si vous le souhaitez. Si vous voulez les poser en anglais, c'est aussi très bien. Donc, sans plus tarder, the floor is yours, Eero, and I'll just go on the slide.
Merci Sofiane, bonjour à tout le monde. Donc, je devrais tout d'abord vous remercier pour cette belle opportunité de visiter Sherbrooke. Et j'ai vraiment profité de mon séjour. Et je sais qu'on devrait continuer en anglais. Et moi il faut absolument pratiquer mon français, mais quand même, je vais continuer ici en anglais, ce qui est un peu plus facile pour moi. And so I switched to English, and I could add that I also take questions in Finnish or Swedish. So that's totally fine as well. So I'm just delighted to be here, and I've been looking forward to this opportunity to talk about open strategy in particular, but let me say that I really enjoyed the stay. We had a nice conversation and a seminar about publishing yesterday, and then we had the opportunity to also engage with Andrew Pettigrew's work yesterday. And in a way, and I'll come back to that in a moment, this talk or this discussion can be linked with Andrew Pettigrew's work on strategy process research. But I'm really feeling excited because of at least 3 reasons now. Well, the first is Sherbrooke, so it's a wonderful, the more I've learned about the city and the more the university, the more I like it. This is testament to that. I mean, what have you? Well, most of you cannot see that because you're forced to look at me and the slides, but hey, that's fantastic. And I heard that one could do some skiing there, so next time I'll try to make sure that the timing works for that. So and I said I really enjoyed our conversations, and then there are nice connections to also yesterday's discussions with Andrew Pettigrew. The second reason is what Sofiane was explaining, and we don't really need to repeat this, that that the world is facing, we are facing grand challenges or wicked problems, however you call them, or big issues that matter. And of course, to be able to deal with those at different levels in society, within and beyond organizational boundaries, we need to also focus attention on strategic decision making and how we do that. And that's the connection to open strategy. So in a way, the premise of this discussion is that unfortunately, both our practices and our theoretical or conceptual models or perspectives on strategic decision making and especially strategy work seem to be lagging behind. And that's the reason for proposing some ideas around open strategy here today. And the third reason for feeling happy actually is that, of course, this is a topic that is close to my heart and research interests. So for quite some time, you made me feel old, like 20 years, it's more than 20 years. So I've been interested in strategic decision making and strategic change, and especially being part of this community of scholars who have been trying to figure out what strategy processes and practices are all about. And I, as a person, also been especially interested in communication and the role of language or discourse and narratives in all of that. And I think you said that there's like something from me in your reading, so for some people here.
So there's at least one group that could actually work on your career.
Yeah, well, that's you are the lucky guys, and this elevates this occasion for me. So anyway, so I'm really curious about these things, and what I'm going to present is not so much as it sometimes is that here's something that we have done in research, or here's a model. This is more like work in progress. So I'm like proposing some things and also have like hidden agenda. The hidden agenda is this. I'm now working on a book on new approaches to strategy work for Oxford University Press. And I should be working on the book right now, but it's because of you guys that I'm here. I'm not working on it. Its deadline is coming soon, so I'm getting nervous about that. But you are like guinea pigs for this also, at least when it comes to thinking about the new approaches and the role of open strategy. So please, anytime interrupt me or, shout if you have something, if you strongly agree or disagree, or you just have other things that you want to share. So that's the spirit of it. And I've been given instructions though that I should stick to this 35-minute timeline. Right? I think we can do this, but it's even better if there's a real dialogue. So you guys just say whatever comes to mind. So that's the plan. That's the game plan for this session. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through the history of strategic decision making and strategy work in like 4 minutes. So for another audience, it would take like half a year. But I'm trusting that the exceptional, analytical capabilities here in this room will make it a smooth run for us. And I apologize also for my really bad sense of humor. Feeling happy that this happens. Usually it goes such that when I have like jokes that I want to tell, no one gets them. But unfortunately, they laugh at other times, so that kind of compensates. So what I'm going to say here is basically that even if the idea here is to focus on the future and the challenges that we are facing, let's just take a few moments to step back and think about our typical approaches, perspectives, and models of strategic decision making, in particular strategy work. By the way, I prefer the term strategy work to strategic planning, for instance, which used to be the term that we're using in terms of deliberate efforts to, think about how we are going to solve some issues or how we are going to develop our strategies, whether they are for the university or school or company or society or for a social movement. When did it get started? Probably a really long time ago. I think organizations and strategies have probably been there for about like 10,000 years. give and take some, but it's skipping, the history of mankind really. And I know that, decision making has been a key part of organized social activity for a real long time. I'm skipping all that. I'm zooming in on what has been happening mostly after the Second World War, because it's then that the vocabulary and the practices of strategic decision making and strategic management really gain ground in corporations and gradually also in other types of organizations. But it used to be what I would call 0.1, that it was very much like individual decision makers who were sharing their ideas about strategies among their counterparts in their top management teams. So we'll want to spend too much time on that. Then came the golden age of strategic planning, when I suppose the early 1960s are a time point when it started to happen, not really far from here, or maybe it was here on the East Coast, in the sense of universities, consultants, big corporations jointly gradually developed the practices of strategic planning that are a key part of our heritage in terms of how to make decisions in and around corporations in particular. Of course, some of the practices may now appear like strange, because when studying what it used to be in the 1960s, for instance, it was not unusual that you developed your strategic plans and then you put them into the company safe. Probably, we labeled them top secret. It was important that competitive advantage and other things were not, spreading around to any people. But of course, this proved to be problematic, and I'm simplifying grossly the story here, but there's a point that I'm coming to. So this paved the way for new kinds of approaches, especially taking other stakeholders within the organization seriously. So hence, at least since the early 1980s, probably many places much earlier, in some places much later, strategy processes started to look different, in the sense that they were designed to engage, to help people engage. So, and why? Because of basically by having people involved, you would get their views, and also in the best of cases, you would get access to new ideas and perhaps weak signals, and yeah, by involving people, you also are a lot closer to getting their commitment, and perhaps to getting there in terms of the implementation of strategy. We could stop here, because in many ways I think this trend is still going on, but I think that with the crisis that we've been facing, we will also be coming to a time point that would be called 3.0. I see some hands up, so please, maybe you first, and then you.
Just to make sure that I understand well, stakeholders means some people around the company, not just the people who are actually stakeholders. I'm not sure to understand. That's the right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm using this term, probably many others, in a very free manner, so open-endedly. But I think the tradition is that in terms of strategic decision making and strategy work, most of our stuff, our books that we have, the articles we have been in this mode of thinking about what happens within an organization. And the questions about engagement have been primarily in the past about how to engage our employees, for instance, which is a tall already. But it's 3.0 where we are, I think, in many places right now. And it's a real question mark also in terms of what it means. But what I'm trying to and struggling to explain here is that there is this need to go even further with when dealing with these big issues, to engage with different stakeholders outside traditional organizational boundaries. And there's a need to develop ways in which we can strategize together across or between organizations, be they companies or other actors. And it's a real question mark for us here today, and at least for me, maybe you've solved it, but in terms of what this is, and probably there is no one answer as to what it could be in a particular setting. I've been holding you back for a moment, so please.
it's kind of the same question, but in terms of like the stakeholders, are we talking about like the CEO or like the employees or more like outsiders?
Yeah.
External.
Yeah. It's a great question because my good friend and colleague Richard Whittington would say that it's a question of opening strategy. Actually, he has a really nice book. So you could think about that book, but if Christmas is coming and if you need to, if you have a partner, kids, friends, or anyone else, maybe you could think about the new book that is coming out, sometime next year from Oxford University Press. But the opening as a verb very well, I think describes this. So it's not that we wouldn't have these practices in organizations, but that it's an opening in terms of adding new layers of you could call them in an old-fashioned way planning or new ways of negotiation or discussing or strategy formulation or formation, ideation, etc. And we have come as far as this in the sense that the stakeholders are also beyond the organizational boundaries, and hence the linkage to open strategy. Okay, I was probably already like, fine. They made this for me, so maybe it's for others as well. It shouldn't go, too far. Yeah, okay. So what is this strategy work 3.0? And I'm really happy that we are already into this discussion. I just have some bullet points that I wanted to share, and then I'll mention a few other things, and then we'll get into open strategy, which is the main thing. But clearly there are characteristics that are different from what was the 1.0 or 2.0. So it is and it should be, more open in terms of involving more people within organizations as well as beyond organizational boundaries, and also with these big challenges that we have been facing. Or if I'm thinking first about companies, for instance, ever since, I suppose, or at the latest after the financial crisis, it's become also clear that strategy work has to be agile. This is where it gets different from these very systematic processes of involving people, which, however, it may take really long time to have some effect, or as you know, in many places, there may be, for instance, a 4-year cycle or biannual planning thing or clock for the board or top management, which says that it's at this particular point of time that we should be doing strategic planning. It seems to me that times have changed and that these new approaches, which call for flexibility and an action, are gaining ground, and for good reasons. Yeah.
There's a point in time or something happens in the world that changes the way we think about that strategy work, that push the society to go to work or it's just evolution.
Yeah, it's a great question. And personally, I'm thinking about the crisis that we've been experiencing. So I don't know where we should start with the crisis. There are too many crises and big issues. But I would start with financial crisis because it clearly was a kind of a shock for many companies and organizations. I mean, there have been crises before the great financial crisis of the 2008 or so. That was what we know. But the pandemic also has clearly had this effect. That, as you know, the effects have been unevenly distributed, but in many industries, for many companies, for many organizations, this really meant that it's not that they could wait until the next, year or the year after that to engage in strategic planning, but action was called for immediately to deal with the issues short term, long term. But that is a great question. I think that's also perhaps a question or a challenge to anyone studying these things and to also see how it may vary depending on where we are. Quebec may be different from, I don't know, Sweden, for instance, or maybe it's actually very similar. It could be very different from some other parts of the world where perhaps organizational cultures and practices of decision making are just different. But there are these challenges, and I'm not going to repeat everything I have on these slides, but clearly it's not easy. It's easy to say that we should include all possible stakeholders, and we should be thinking big in terms of solving bigger issues, or making sure that our companies' new strategies are contributing to these bigger causes, even if not solving those. But it's not easy, and it's definitely not easy to create the shared understanding or to orchestrate such distributed strategy. I'm not sure if this makes sense, but at least some people are nodding, so it's a good sign. So if I'm not asleep, that's great, and there's some agreement here. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but let me just advertise that as it happens, we had a research project where we got to follow strategic decision making and strategy work. I'm still doing this in a project that is called Future of Work, and there are some key themes that seem to be emerging here, which I think resonate with the fact that we are moving to modes of strategy work that are different from the past. Did you have a question?
I'll ask it later.
Well, you could. I mean, thank you. You're very, very, very thoughtful and considerate. But we can take questions anytime. But it seems that the end result is the same. The conclusion is that it remains very difficult to construct shared understanding. And in this question, perhaps I'm a broken record here in terms of repeating the point that it's hard to organize or orchestrate or lead this kind of. So one approach that may help us conceptually and also in practice is then open strategy. And I'm not the only person. I'm not definitely the first person who is using this term, but I'm really excited about this because if I go back to the initial figure, I think open strategy that can be seen as one form, one new approach in 3.0 is like a 180 degree, there's 180 degrees difference from the tradition of 1.0, which is that, okay, we make our decisions, we develop our strategies, but we definitely don't share them with others, so that it's the role of top managers only to do this stuff. Whereas open strategy in principle goes all the way to the other direction. So principle, if it's a revolutionary idea, though resonant with the other open stuff that we have in the world, like what open innovation, open data, open access, probably many other open things that I cannot remember at this point. So there's a resonance with this, and maybe this goes with your question in terms of what's happening in society that is moving us to this direction. And I'm also mindful that open strategy is probably not working in all parts of the world or industries, nor am I saying that that's the solution for every kind of circumstance that companies or other organizations would find themselves in. But I think it's a wonderful idea because of these two characteristics: inclusion, including as many stakeholders, I'm using that term, or people as possible, and then being transparent. So far, so good, except that it's really hard to manage, lead, orchestrate, organize such strategy work. And we had this conversation with Sophia. We've had many good conversations on our way here. So he's my chauffeur. So that's good. So we'll keep that going. So about what does it mean? And I realized that when there's opening, there's also closing, and the practical challenges about open strategy actually mean that we are confronting these questions about what kind of openness, when and for whom and how. And therefore, I'm going to advertise, in addition to the great book, which is a good gift item in the future. So don't spend all your money this Christmas, maybe it's next year later on. I'm also advertising this paper where I, with my good friends and colleagues, got to reflect about open strategy. And we basically tried to make sense of it in terms of three alternative ways of doing it basically. One is that would be like a limited participation. Perhaps not very difficult from the strategy processes that many of us have been part of for a long time. Like, there's a part of the process where the University of Sherbrooke, and I don't know whether this is the case, asks its students about ideas for the future or reaches out to other stakeholders. So that's one way of thinking about open strategy. And from a pragmatic point of view, this may already be a great thing for many strategy processes because it helps to bring more inclusion and hopefully also more transparency into this process. The other alternative is to go a bit further. And this can be seen as co-creation of strategies. And here I'm getting into the Wikimedia example. By the way, Wikimedia is the organization behind Wikipedia. So I typically get these things confused. So we could just be talking about Wikipedia, but the organization is Wikimedia. And if you think about Wikimedia, the way it works in terms of Wikipedia, you can think about the wiki pages. So with some limitations, basically anyone can edit what's there. I mean, the content about the University of Sherbrooke, for instance. It's not like you can just go and edit that text, but with some constraints or limitations, you get access to it. So I think that's a good metaphor and a concrete example of an open strategy process, which goes further in terms of co-creation, so that anyone could, in principle, you can think about sharing a document. Although not all strategizing needs to be about, working on a piece of text. So of course, many other things, but I think this serves as a good example and a metaphor for what open strategy can mean in terms of co-creation. Like different stakeholders would be more or less on an equal footing in terms of being able to have a real impact on the strategies, which I think is a wonderful idea. And of course, it can go even further in terms of thinking that the rules of the game in terms of what to do, when and how, and for what purpose would be something that one would collectively decide upon. I think it's here where we're getting closer to the utopia of open strategy. But I would say that at least in many social movements, we may find such characteristics. By the way, you could also think about Wikimedia as a social movement. It's largely a social movement based on voluntary work. So maybe that's why it's resonant, and that's why I'm having it here as the clearest and probably most advanced example I know in terms of open strategy. But one could think about many other social movements, what any of us know about, what Greenpeace, for instance, and there the challenge would be, I guess, to try to benefit from what we know about strategy work from other contexts, so that, being able to deal with the big issues, be they about climate change or war or terror, that one would be in a better position with to develop strategic thinking ultimately. Yes, please.
A quick question. So, as I'm listening, asking myself, what are the boundary conditions of it? So, for example, does that apply in any case? For example, crisis. A lot of citizens criticize the government for taking top-down decisions. We can understand, we can blame. So, for example, if the crisis at a good moment can solve and have a
yeah.
Probably thought of it.
Yeah, that's a great question, because the answer is not self-evident. It could be that, organizations or companies or societies are facing crises that really call for action, like that there may not be time to really consult all parties, and it's more a question of like moving on, doing something, and that would then perhaps not resonate so well with the idea of open strategy as it's being practiced, for instance, with Wikimedia. On the other hand, with the pandemic, with also the research project that I mentioned, we saw many companies who were in harm's way, were facing really big difficulties, perhaps surprisingly using methods of crowdsourcing, for instance, to get ideas as to how to change our operations or radically move to something else because we cannot do what we've been doing before. So in that sense, I'm really poor with boundary conditions in terms of setting limits, especially because I do see that under this label or banner or this thing, open strategy, we can actually see like different alternatives. But it's not easy, and here's a list of difficulties. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just want to say that there are people who have been studying these processes and observing how they go, and they've been pointing out these dilemmas. I think dilemma is a good term. Paradox is another term that is very fashionable. I think these are good terms because they help us move forward or move from this idea that we could simply like make the best decisions, for instance, and then just move on. But that one has usually like two sides of the coin. Not going to mention all of them, but just pointing out to the dilemma process, that the more or the wider the engagement, usually the more time it takes and the less there is opportunity to be agile or flexible. I also want to highlight dilemma of disclosure, which basically means that the wider the participation, the more transparency, the better it is in many ways, but you may be in a difficult spot in terms of dealing with really sensitive issues or difficult issues. So in terms of trust or keeping things to yourself, and I'm here also thinking about, for instance, listed companies who cannot share everything under, for instance, stock market regulations. You know what I'm talking about. And perhaps the final one I want to highlight, because I added this to the list of my good friends and colleagues who have been studying these things, that there's also a risk with open strategy that becomes ritualistic or ceremonial or not authentic, in the sense that we're just asking you guys about your views, but we really don't care type of a process. Or as you know, sometimes decisions have already been made, and it's more like a question of like going through a performance in terms of asking for others' consent or ideas as to what to go for. But I do want to, and I know that we're kind of short of time in terms of the initial schedule, but I do want to mention the Wikimedia case because I think it's a fantastic example that one can learn from. It's also perhaps easy to see the resonance. I hope it's easy to see the resonance with this kind of a social movement, voluntary organization, which has participation and inclusion and transparency as its core values. Well, I'm trying to say it's easy to see the resonance of that with open strategy and its ideals and many of its practices. They've actually gone through a couple of rounds of open strategy work. And I'm just going to quickly mention that the one process that I got to observe and to be a part of at the end of the process is the one that has been or is accessible in terms of Wikimedia strategy playbook. So if you just Google that, you'll find a strategy playbook, which in my view is a wonderful. Well, I got to write the foreword, so that's what I'm saying. So it's like a wonderful collection of guidelines as to how to orchestrate open strategy work. And it's not only about Wikimedia, but this playbook is intended for anyone else who is interested in these things, whether it's a question of another social movement or a company or a public organization, or for instance, a government. So there are a lot of points, some of which are kind of if not obvious, at least easy to understand. Like the more you plan in advance the open strategy work, the better it usually goes. Or that it has to be really based on true collaboration. Though collaboration and communication in Wikimedia's experience has to be also sometimes tailor-made, or it may require some effort to reach particular stakeholders. So, for instance, in the Wikimedia process, a lot of care was taken when reaching out to such stakeholders which were not in Europe or North America, or participants who were more marginal ones than those who have been there for a long time at the center stage. So it wasn't a question of like one big discussions, everyone participating, but it was broken down into particular activities and meetings and workshops, in between which then different teams worked on these emerging strategic ideas and initiatives, ultimately leading to their final strategy documents and other things that emerge from this. So I'm not going to go through all of these things, although I do believe these are good points, but I want to advertise once again that this is easy. Just anyone can get access to this, and hopefully learn from Wikimedia's experiences and whether successes.
Eero,
Yes.
Would that be possible to have access to that slide? Because I think it's pretty great. All the
Yeah.
On the link we'll see this figure.
And everything else. All right. So
Okay.
free of charge.
Mais là, c'est à mettre dans votre coffre à outils. Ça, quand on organise une stratégie participative, on a tous les key points, tous les éléments importants. I love it. It's amazing.
Merci. Je suis d'accord, because I do believe I've been involved in a few strategy processes, and I think this is better than most of the consulting companies providing like their models or frameworks. And this is not anything away from consulting companies, and a lot of friends who are consultants and also want to contribute to solving bigger issues and developing more participatory practices. But I absolutely think this is a nice document. It looks really long. It's about like 100 pages, but there's not so much on one page. They also have included a lot of photos and like anecdotes, which make it more real in terms of sharing not only the successes but also the challenges involved. But I think I'll stop here, if that's okay. And apologies for being a little bit.
I think we're good.
A little bit.
I think we're good and
late. Yeah. So I might have some points about future research, but I think that this is the most important thing, at least in my view. So I'm just curious to hear then about your reflections or thoughts, or have more questions, please.
So I think Marie-Luc has a question. I will have one later too. And maybe, Gaël later.
Je vous propose juste, avant qu'on s'entre, des petites règles du jeu. Essayez de parler fort le plus que vous êtes en mesure de le faire pour que les collègues qui sont à distance soient en mesure de vous entendre dans le fond. Si c'est pas suffisamment fort, pas grave, moi je reformule par écrit. Donc, vous y allez avec la puissance de voix que vous pouvez, mais le plus fort le mieux. Merci.
Oui, je pense Marie-Luc. Il y a des Gaël, Julien.
So what comes to mind is the fact that, well, it's called open strategy, and you made the link to everything that's open nowadays in society ties very much to technology, digital technologies, right? And so I'm wondering, what's the role you see in digital technologies, like in the expansion, or like, does it go from something that's pretty low tech to something that necessarily spans like boundaries through digital technologies? And then perhaps I'll have another question after.
But that's a great question, and probably you have better answers to this than I can provide. But I definitely see technology, communication technology, a big part of this development. Also, in what I was trying to describe as the strategy work 2.0. So without the technologies that we take for granted, it wouldn't be possible to involve a number of different actors or stakeholders. But definitely in terms of open strategy, I think, to be honest, the recent times with the pandemic have been teaching us a lot about how to use these different things we have in new ways, and I think it's definitely helpful. But there's the other side, which is that if we're dealing with really complex issues and people have different views, there are dilemmas, there's disagreement, then it's really hard to solve those, from distance. That goes back to these issues of trust and an ability to, Andrew Pettigrew was talking about that yesterday, to frame things anew, to be able to develop ways in which we can really focus on different things. So I think it's both. Now, the Wikimedia example told here is interesting because it happened just before the pandemic came, or to be more exact, most of the things were organized before that. If I had my good friend Nicole Eber here, who's the global strategy director of Wikimedia, she would tell you that in her view, it's still an ongoing process because they are moving from these key ideas and principles and initiatives to their implementation. So in many ways, what's described here, though, benefited from a time before the pandemic. That's why so many workshops are organized in different places, face to face. And so if you go to those pages, you also see a lot of photos where you see this human interaction being part of it.
I'm gonna try to.
Yes,
Yes.
before.
Okay, yes, okay. I'll try to speak in English, but yes. Okay, so it's a question and maybe more thinking about everything. I really like the dilemma input because I studied it was not a company, but an organization that every decision making had to be unanimous. And everybody talking was not able to have more than a certain time, and that's really great. But at the same time, it becomes really heavy, the process of decision making, a lot of time and effort, and I feel like it can demobilize maybe the person to really participate. At a certain time, it's just too long, so everybody's gonna shut down and do whatever it is. So how is and maybe Wikimedia, I don't think will respond to my question, but how is a way that we can implement maybe step by step, more open strategy, so the organization doesn't feel that it's too much, and we'll stay mobilized and we'll keep continuing.
Yeah. A great question, and I also appreciate the example. So I'm, in all honesty, thinking that the way open strategy is organized must be different and must be geared towards the context and the issues at hand. So I can think that sometimes there can be a relatively short process involving some key events where different stakeholders would be
It's fine.
would be involved, whereas then we have at the extreme the Wikimedia type of case where it's taking a really long time with numerous occasions organized differently with different rules and technologies with different participants. why I like the Wikimedia case is also that they were learning as they were doing. So that was great, and that they were not fixed into thinking that, okay, here's this one town hall, and then we have to come up with a decision. But they were able to flexibly add new streams of activities, new discussions, and work on these different ideas and documents in between the sessions. I do get what you're saying about like some of the ways in which we want to organize democratic, equality-based decision making, that such processes may not always succeed because they feel, time consuming, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps not able either to deliver like new insights. It's more a question of like some kind of consensus or compromise. I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think what you say, the company will have to go like the radical step at the beginning, try to make a little bit more involved.
Yeah.
More,
I think so. And I think that when we're dealing with complex problems and big issues involving multiple organizations in society, then especially in those cases, it probably requires like a lot of thinking and orchestration beforehand and backstage to move things forward. But like you're saying, for particular companies, let's say if they have been more conservative in their approaches, adding some elements of open strategy can also be helpful.
Interesting, because my question in the same lines. I actually had the chance to study co-op management, the École de gestion a few years back, and had the chance to be part of different collaborative decision making and also like cooperation, and like the different terms you put on like strategy work, and it really resonates with what I lived in the past. And the dilemma, that's why I laughed, because when like the first one was on the process and the challenge of mobilizing a lot of people and staying agile. And I was wondering if you have some insights or some examples of processes or organizations that can like take this town hall where you can meet all those people, and then there's the implementation part that falls into the hands of different people closer to the work that needs to be done. And it's like the part in between that is hard, where you can, how do you stay in link with all those people, but you work with them in the implementation. So I don't know if there's like a great example of like this part of getting strategic ideas and getting them to the implementation.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing your experience and background in that, which I understand also resonates here. The question is really challenging in terms of this. I suppose it goes to back to the classic question of strategy formation versus strategy implementation. I think Wikimedia is an easy example because in many ways involving the volunteers helped a great deal, because they would be the same people running the show and in a way implementing those. I think that also some other cases that I know from professional service organizations or city organizations, I think they also benefit from this, that at least those people who are professionals, that they are like doing both. I unfortunately don't have great examples of more traditional, let's say, manufacturing organizations or let's say retail organizations or others, but I know people have been bringing these ideas forward, but where it easily may be that it's still like a big part of the workforce who is not involved, or at least not as much as others. I also can mention some cases of startups, but there again, it's somewhat easier because you can have a startup of like a handful of people or an organization like this, and it's just so much easier to together talk about things and deal with that. So I'm falling short of a great example. But in principle, I do think that this basic idea of engaging people as much as possible, what we could call strategy formation, helps a great deal in terms of implementation.
I will feel there's a, and then I have a question.
I want to make a parallel with a concept developed by a philosopher of law, John Rawls, maybe you know him, the overlapping consensus. And I think there's something close to what the open strategy and the co-created strategy. The concept of overlapping consensus is based on the idea that in our society, people and groups don't agree on everything. But sometimes they have an agreement. They have an overlapping consensus. And then John Rawls says we have to build on that. It's not a permanent consensus in condition, but we have to build on that because people develop trust to each other in a consensus. And he said after that, they are closer than before. And then we have to reach another overlapping consensus. And the way you present the co-creative strategy with other organization from outside, for me looked like this kind of concept. And in law, it's operative for society with a lot of diversity like us. And so I want to hear you on that, the link between this concept and
I think that's just a great thing about the greatest point I've heard. I think sure. So you're winning. I should go back and read John Rawls. So that's not related to the veil of people.
You know, in his book, all goes all the time together, but it's in liberalizing liberal. Remember the exact name, but I can say it to you. The paper develop
because this is really to me like a wake up call. Because to be honest, also in some articles that there's, for instance, one that I wrote with my colleagues about strategy work in city organization that came out in Organization Science last year. One in Strategic Management Journal. So our fields, I think what I've been learning is to become like critical towards the idea of consensus in the sense, and maybe it goes back to one of the questions here as well, that maybe that we don't go too far with when we think that we have to have consensus, and it often sounds like sidestepping or going around things where we thought that we would not have to make a call after consensus would be means to go forward. Which does link with Andrew Pettigrew, and I know that not everyone was there. His point about like yesterday explaining the good things about the North Ireland peace process and reframing that. But now with that idea, overlapping consensus, I can see that would actually be a marvelous way of looking at consensus from a very dynamic perspective. Looking at these different stakeholders.
He said people keep other value, but they reach a consensus on some part of the value, and it's good. We built on that. The book is political liberalism. In this book, he developed more this concept also.
I'm not sure, but I think I heard John Rawls once in California. Long time.
Okay, man.
He was like reading the thing like philosophers. It's not like a presentation like this. It's more like you have written. So it has to be precise, and that was also commended. It was University of California. I don't recall anymore which one it was. But that's a really inspiring thought, and also appreciate the other comments and questions, which make us think and probably go much further than my snapshots and arguments about open strategy here.
Yes, yes, another question. So I'd like to bring the cultural aspect of work in France. We're talking about France. Louder.
Oui.
Yes, okay, I'll do my best. So, let's take the example of France or any other country which is, quite vertical, where, hierarchy is really important. So, I work with some companies, let's say, in North Africa, who have this quite vertical way of seeing their organization. And so the top management is seen as the big boss, the leader, almost like God for the organization. So how do you think this perspective of open strategy could apply such cultural, framing where we're expecting these people to decide for us, because that's why they are paid for, and that's why they have this high social status.
A great question, and a reminder of the limits, and probably you were after this with the boundary condition question, and I wasn't able to address those aspects. Let me first say where I've seen open strategy practice perhaps most, and that does resonate with certain cultural institutional starting points. So my home country, Finland, Sweden, perhaps the Nordic countries overall, Silicon Valley on the other, these are also places where I've lived, so I know more about them than some other places. Perhaps there's resonance because of some appreciation of flat hierarchy and tolerance of some debate and criticism, and perhaps this overall, at least in Silicon Valley, drive towards like, let's think anew, let's try to develop new ideas and solutions. But I agree that in more conservative traditional context, and this might also apply for industries, it's maybe much harder. And you mentioned France. I could also add the UK. What a complex society that is, so that in some places in France and the UK, I think it's the fantastic opportunities to conduct open strategy, but in some other places, not so much, I would think. But then you could also think about this the other way around. If the processes and the practices are very conventional, maybe bringing some elements of open strategy could be just, bringing the greatest reward in terms of moving it forward, and perhaps helping people who are of the younger generations to be involved. I don't know. Is that wishful thinking?
No, great. So yeah.
To continue on your question, maybe they could do it on a smaller scale. Sorry, I will speak louder. Maybe they could do it on a smaller scale, just because sometimes the hierarchy of those kind of companies or organization, it's kind of an ego trip. Sometimes they want to stay at the top, but if there are like smaller teams that do smaller stuff, the younger generation can still feel like they are doing something new and different, but it's not like causing kind of a rupture between the big boss and the team. I don't know if it's something that is feasible in those kind of organizations.
I think it's totally feasible and it makes a lot of sense. Exactly that. I mean, each organization has its own traditions in terms of decision making and strategy work. If there is organized strategy work, it might be just too much to ask. That would be like a total change from something that people have grown into appreciate. So step by step, I think it's very valuable.
Exactly the idea of this. Do you think if the organization have a big history, do you think it's a problem for the open strategy. The fact that let's say in England there are big companies that have had a big history in terms of effectiveness and all those things. Do you think it's a limit of the open strategy?
Yeah, probably is. I think you're right. I'm just quickly thinking about some examples from the more conventional areas.
Yeah, let's say the Volkswagen or Honda or Toyota. Don't go for those kind of strategy very often. When I know. So do you think those organizations would have more problems than opportunities in the open strategy?
Well, I would always say that there are opportunities. It's just a question of how it's being brought into the process. And as just suggested, it can be like a small step approach, I think. I'm trying to think about like relatively famous examples, and it's not exactly those industries, but in banking, Barclays is famous for what they did in their retail banking about 10 years ago, getting excited about open strategy in a context that is very conservative. I mean, British bank, and hopefully no one is offended here in terms of if Barclays client or something. So it can be done. Of course, we also understand that the crisis, and you were into this earlier, that may be the impetus for drivers of change in the way we make decisions or the way we strategize. They also the opportunities to bring in new practices, such as open strategy practices. Also, if there are other changes, we know that when there's maybe here we combine the idea that there's a big chief, like a new CEO, like the new sheriff that comes to town, it might be to that person's benefit or would help to move the organization forward if also strategy work was conducted in a new manner. I see that there's a question there.
Yes,
I've been waiting patiently.
I'm a lot we'll be okay with that. So thank you for the presentation. And my question was about, in Wikimedia's case, I feel like it was easy to get some outside stakeholders because like everyone wants to have access to free knowledge on the internet and all. So I was wondering, do you have any clues or ideas on how to provide companies ideas for how to get the outside stakeholders, how to identify the people outside the organization who could like have an interesting point of view and participate in focus group? And I'm not sure if it's clear my question, but how can we identify these outside stakeholders for big companies?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. To be honest, I don't think it's the identification that's the problem. It's more like having them engaged, having them, dedicate time and effort when people are busy and have other priorities as well. So what we can learn from Wikimedia and some other cases is that one should try to do this on the terms of those stakeholders, taking into account their situations and preferences, the ways in which they typically approach these issues. I think that helps a great deal. So it can be a very different thing for let me just give an example from my previous university. So I also get to advertise Aalto University in Helsinki. So their strategy process a few years ago was called Living Strategy, which is another label I like. And it was characterized by this, that there were other means or specific means developed to reach, for instance, to the students in terms of gamification of some parts of the strategy process. There were other types of ways to use to reach to stakeholders such as big companies who were like important collaboration partners to get the most out of them. So it's a very partial answer to your question, but the question is good. I think it's less about identification, it's more how to make them.
And how did they do it? Yeah.
Well, they did it such that that probably probably when it started to go well, that created like a positive momentum. So more and more people, thousands of more and more people were then interested in participating. And it's true that the basis is also the same, that it's a voluntary organization, so people, these are the same people who contribute to the actual content and its maintenance. But yeah, I think they did well, following the same logic that it's not like one standard approach, or not like one town hall meeting or one online platform, but several, and work in a process to distill the new ideas, to develop them, to elaborate on them. And I think that hard work paid off, because then the different stakeholders were able to participate mostly on their own terms, and they were also helped to understand what happens next in the process. So their expectations were also, I think, mostly managed rather well.
That one. I was struck by the resemblance with of open strategy with with anarchism as a way of organizing. And for anarchists, decision-making process always has been problematic, in the sense that it's where the nexus of power lies will be. We're talking yesterday about extreme cases, case studies, and I think that we provided such a looking into boundary conditions, you might find something valuable in such radical experience. I find from having studied it a little bit in the past, but I don't know if it's any help. Wikimedia is a good example, but it's not a question. I realize. I just maybe the question is, you can have a free book.
Yeah. Well, I love the idea of anarchy, and I'm not the expert in anarchy or how we should define and approach it, but I think I get it. That's a really thought-provoking thing that we can also learn from these extreme organizations that are like organized, even if they sell to say that they're disorganized anarchies. So I love that. I have one example in mind, which is not at all anarchy, but it's a cool example, I think. So there's a Helsinki-based game development company called Future Play, and their approach to strategy work is no bullshit. So if you Google them, you'll see that it's not like just like a joke, but you can see that almost on the front page. It's no bullshit. They explain what no bullshit means. It, of course, means many things to them in terms of focusing on things that matter. That's my interpretation of it, and trying to get rid of middle management and other bureaucratic structures that they think are not helping. And at the same time, no bullshit, especially in the words of their CEO, Jamie Lyles, who's also a good friend, means that it's, can you believe this? It's like the golden rule to him. Like, now we're getting religious, and I'm not like the greatest expert in that. I don't remember how the golden rule of Christianity or in other religions really goes, but it's more like, you treat the others like you like them to treat yourself. So there's like a really fundamental value basis in trying to live up to this idea of no bullshit, no bullshit. I'm not giving you any bullshit. I'm not taking any bullshit. But that's not anarchy. It could almost be the opposite, but there are some elements to that. And I think in some ways it's an example of open strategy that anyone in this startup, maybe it's not the startup anymore, but a relatively small, very successful company, anyone can like propose and almost do anything. I think it's manageable because the size is relatively small because they've all got socialized into this thing. Most of them are, all of them are shareholders, so there are elements which support this. So that's not anarchy, but that's the best example I could think about.
Well, I'm curious because it seems to me that, like, to rebound on the anarchy sort of discussion and the reflection about like the relevance of bringing up the tensions, right? The dilemmas. It clearly resonates with what we live in organizations. To me, it strikes, and I'm biased, I acknowledge, with the paradox concept. It seems to me here that, and so I'm very intrigued why you chose to use the word dilemma there, because it's like control is autonomy. They go together, they're inseparable. It almost seems like you need control and you need autonomy, and one constitutes the other in your sort of strategy there. And so it makes, for one thing, it makes leadership hard to, but as a leader, it's tough to play your role, right? Because it's almost like you have, well, I'll use a wording that's common, for example, and you have to be consistently inconsistent. You know, one day you could be more into the control part, but the next day it's the autonomy you put forth. But the two of them go together. It's just, and so that's a super hard leadership role to take on. And if we link back to the grand challenges, let's say we go to climate change and we try to hack climate change using an open strategy, and I'll give an example. I think that might be an example, but you tell me, as a service. So mobility as a service, right? So it's very technological, right? And it's something we hear more and more about. And so you have the participation as citizens by contributing the data, my cell phone, everything we do in the city, right? But there's also the consultation, all the steps that we see there that you also have their place there. And you're trying to hack climate change through high level technology, super distributed systems that will require deep learning, Internet of Things, 5G, all of that has huge impact on climate change. And so you see how it flips on itself. It's like you can't put forth something as the solution, because at the same time it becomes a problem. And that's something I feel perhaps needs to be acknowledged in a strategy like that. Very paradoxically, it's like the dynamics at the very bottom, they're paradoxical dynamics.
Yeah, wow, that was profound, and I hope it's recorded. So that's a fantastic way of explaining a lot of things actually in terms of how to tackle the big issues like climate change. And I'm just nodding. I find it easy to agree. Paradox, perhaps not everyone knows this. It's also like a big theme in organization theory right now. So for good reasons, for these reasons and other reasons. So that's why probably what you explain it is the best we can have in terms of understanding that it goes beyond this question of choice or thinking that there's an optimum for things. It's more like a what? Duality or there are two sides of the same coin. This becomes metaphorical. That's not really my intention here. But I think that if I link this back to the basics of open strategy, for instance, this idea of opening and closing, they are paradoxically intertwined in the process itself, as I hope we've been. Guess we've been talking about that all along in terms of like including some people, like in this room, we may be excluding others. That would be an example. Or having a longer term process would help with some issues, but not with all long-term issues, but could leave some other considerations outside. So I do like the paradox thing. That's as far as I can
No,
go. I
that's
think
fine.
your example of hacking the climate change was just great.
That's what I like. That's my bias. That's my feel.
Maybe there's another, but I haven't thought about this at all. Maybe it's stupid, but linking this with the anarchist perspective that maybe climate change is not like one thing that we would somehow solve with the whole meetings or anything else. Maybe that's not the approach. Maybe it's a piecemeal thing. Maybe it's like requires a lot of effort for a long time, and then somehow we tackle some parts of it and not others.
I think that's very true.
Maybe one final question.
Oh, okay. Just to your point, I understand what you're saying. It's just I don't want to oversimplify something because I don't understand the whole concept of it. It's just I understand the paradox about control and autonomy, but for a leader, because I am not in the group, I'm in another master, and we are studying managing projects. And for me, managing projects is that maybe you are yet the leader of your project, but you're also a part of the team. So you can exchange idea and you kind of are in the same level. So it's not like dealing with super big organization. It's really like in a smaller scale. So for me, that paradox, I'm like, I understand it, but it really depends on how you feel you are as a leader, how you are managing yourself in that position. If you are like, oh, I'm a member of this team, so I am going to contribute. So I'm gonna let go of control and go more into the autonomy part. So for me on a smaller scale, that's how I see it. It's kind of the same thing with hacking climate change. I think in a smaller scale of project, you're gonna see, okay, the choice you are making, you're gonna have always like who we can't. I don't have the word in English at the moment yet, pros and cons. So if you are hacking climate change through technology, okay, so what are the pros of it? And is it kind of balancing the cons, or is it really like it's same level and you kind of have like that dilemma of you're gonna have to choose because neither of the solution are good, you know? So maybe it's not the right approach at that moment. I don't know if I'm clear, but it's more like balancing the pros and the cons and see if there is more pros than cons, then maybe it's a good idea, but needs a little bit more work. But if there is more cons than pros, that maybe it's not the right idea. And if they are equal, that maybe the part of that's the real dilemma. If they're really equal in terms of pros and cons, that maybe that's another part you need to explore and be like, oh, it's maybe not the right idea if they are really equal on it. Maybe you need to push further.
I like the example of project management, also the very philosophical fundamental points you raise, and two things come to mind which are not necessarily really good answers to your question. One is that that maybe paradox is not something that one should try to solve. It's maybe something that we live with or
you can
and deal with, and it helps to increase our understanding. Also, then this question of like process, like I'm again trying to link this to strategy process. You know, many other processes in and around organizations, I realize, but maybe like opening and closing or control and autonomy, it's not a question of like, shall we do this at all or not, but it's more like in that process then, and somehow dealing with the choices that one confronts, and then maybe balancing this over time. So those are my
yeah.
You know, so you're the boss. That was supposed to be the last question, but we have, I think,
please.
another one. You decide.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
okay. And before getting,
So it was more a response to what you said, like we need to analyze it on a smaller scale so we are able to see it. I just think like the bias, and especially with climate change, and I think everything is when you try to narrow your vision on a smaller scale, maybe the cons or the pros, you just move them to another field or anything, and that's what we're talking about, like technology. And I know like just people were like, oh yes, I'm not going to go to work, I'm not going to use my car, I'm going to listen to the meeting online, but you use so much data. It's the energy you're using for the computer, sometimes it can become too. So I think it's the same concept a little bit. Even a small organization that try to put this strategy and become really mindful and really like good in their field on a small, but can they really integrate a lot of stakeholders from everywhere, because it's like in English, commercial, like a really specialized field, and it's not like accessible to everyone that you might want to.
I think that that's a really good example. And also then think about the bigger issues in society. It's probably not so that every organization should be solving climate change in the same way, but it may be that there's a contribution that is different in that specific context to compared to the other one. So I think that's about it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Eero. And I think we should have you again to keep on, talking about this topic, because the debate was really
I appreciate great debate and great questions. So thank you very much.
Well, first, thank you very much, Eero. I think it was really a nice talk and also really nice discussion. Absolutely, debate. So, merci aussi à tous les participants, à toutes les participantes, ceux qui sont avec nous à distance, ceux aussi et celles qui sont avec nous sur place. Donc, ça clôt la conférence. Et avant qu'on se quitte, j'aimerais donner la parole donc à Céline et à Julien. Donc, Julien qui nous a gentiment et généreusement accueillis dans cette salle. Donc, un petit mot. Ouais.
Je me faufile dans la discussion. Je voulais juste vous présenter un concours qu'on a décidé d'accrocher avec l'Université de Sherbrooke il y a à peu près 3-4 ans. Aujourd'hui, c'est Julien qui est le coordinateur. Moi, je fais partie des coachs pour ce concours-là. On est 4 profs de différentes facultés. C'est un concours qui s'appelle Maths de système, qui est centré sur la prise en charge ou la résolution de problèmes complexes. Donc, l'idée de base du concours, c'est de dire aujourd'hui, il y a des problèmes qu'on frappe régulièrement, puis on n'arrive jamais à les changer, quelles que soient les décisions qu'on prend, diminuer les seuils de pauvreté, augmenter. Donc, c'est des problèmes qui sont comme récurrents. Et ces problèmes-là, on pourrait peut-être les observer avec une approche systémique pour essayer de comprendre qu'est-ce qui fait que dans le système, on reproduit toujours la même chose. Donc, c'est vraiment un concours axé sur la résolution de problèmes par une approche systémique. Je ne vais pas rentrer dans le détail, là. Ça s'appelle Maths de système. L'idée, c'est de relever des défis mondiaux complexes avec l'idée, premièrement, de comprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe réellement via cette approche systémique et ensuite, éventuellement, de mettre en place des leviers de changement pour pouvoir résoudre justement les questions qu'on pose. C'est un concours qui commence en janvier, qui se termine en juin. Il y a 3 ans, on est allé en finale canadienne. Il y a 2 ans, on a gagné la finale canadienne et cette année, on est allé en finale internationale. Donc, je pense que je vous invite à gagner la finale internationale cette année. Les exemples de sujets, donc l'année dernière, par exemple, c'est 2 étudiantes qui ont parlé des enjeux de santé mentale aux études supérieures. Comment ça se fait? En gros, la question qu'elles posaient, c'est comment ça se fait que plus on en parle, plus on a l'impression que ça se répète dans le temps et qu'il n'y a rien qui change vraiment. Donc, elles ont pris cet angle-là, puis elles sont allées jusqu'en finale internationale avec cette question et avec l'analyse qui allait derrière. Il y a 2 ans, c'était sur la gestion des changements climatiques auprès des agriculteurs. Enfin, voilà. Donc, il faut un sujet qui vous motive, sur lequel vous êtes engagé, faire partie de l'Université de Sherbrooke, parce que nous, on est membres. Et ensuite, il y a tout un planning, donc inscription en janvier. On vous aide, on est des coachs, autant que vous venez nous voir, on vous aide à formaliser votre mapping, on concourt et on gagne. Voilà. Et peut-être, dernière chose, le 11 octobre, là je vous le fais à toute vitesse pour rester dans les horaires, mais le 11 octobre, réunion d'information beaucoup plus calme, précise, ordonnée, avec Julien et d'autres coachs. à la salle du deuxième étage ici, du studio de création, si tu veux ajouter une intervention.
On voulait glisser un mot aussi parce qu'on trouvait que c'était un timing intéressant comme c'est l'Université d'Oxford, directement le State de Business School qui organise ce concours-là. Puis oui, il y a la partie compétition, mais c'est vraiment développer les outils de pensée systémique pour analyser des problèmes complexes, puis qui va directement dans le sens de faire ce travail de stratégie-là avec différentes parties prenantes, puis comment les identifier, comment établir les interrelations. Donc, peut-être par l'événement, on pourra vous envoyer des détails de l'invitation pour le 11 octobre. Si vous êtes intéressé à participer à cette démarche-là, travailler avec d'autres étudiants, analyser des problèmes complexes,
En gros, s'il y a un sujet qui vous indigne ou quelque chose que vous avez vraiment envie de mieux comprendre, que vous êtes motivé à vous engager dans la compréhension de ce problème, voir quelles solutions vous pourrez apporter, on peut vous accompagner dans cette démarche. Voilà.
Merci à tous. Dernière seconde de votre temps, simplement pour réitérer nos remerciements à Pr Eero Vaara de nous avoir si généreusement donné de son temps hier, aujourd'hui, puis d'avoir partagé avec nous, en fait, votre vision sur les processus de décision stratégique ouverts. Je voudrais lui souhaiter, en fait, vous souhaiter une excellente rédaction. On a bien hâte de lire votre livre sur le sujet. Pour le reste, un petit mot pour vous dire que la conférence d'aujourd'hui, puis l'activité d'hier, pas la conférence de Peter, Andrew Pettigrew, mais en fait, le séminaire avec Pr Eero s'inscrit dans la programmation d'activité du Centre Lemaire en gestion responsable. Notre mandat au Centre Lemaire, c'est un peu d'animer la discussion sur ces sujets-là, soit des sujets en recherche, soit des sujets sur la gestion responsable. Sur des thèmes comme le développement durable, évidemment, la santé organisationnelle, la finance responsable, etc. Donc, c'est vraiment pour vous dire que prochaine grande conférence en mai prochain, qui va porter sur le sport responsable, on va avoir une conférence causerie avec des commanditaires, des agences mondiales antidopage, des agences nationales et internationales qui vont venir discuter là, de l'enjeu du dopage dans le sport et de l'aspect gouvernance dans le fond de cette truc-là.
Maxime, peut-être juste un petit rappel. Vous avez débouché à la sortie, sentez-vous à l'aise, prenez-en autant que vous souhaitez. Idéalement, c'est qu'on termine, qu'on vive tous les plateaux là.
Merci encore de votre présence et de votre participation et de toutes vos questions et discussions. Merci.